Nearly 50 years ago, a 12-year-old girl walked out of the Sacramento library on a summer afternoon and vanished completely, leaving her family submerged in grief with no answers. Investigators suspected a mysterious man seen around the neighborhood that day, but no body was found. There was no clear evidence, and the case quickly faded into obscurity. Yet for decades, the girl's loved ones never gave up hope, clinging to the slim possibility that the child was still out there somewhere. Then one day, when an old evidence storage room was digitized, a detail forgotten for half a century suddenly emerged. A small clue, but powerful enough to upend the entire case and leave seasoned investigators stunned. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next cases. On the afternoon of June 14, 1975, in Sacramento, California, the heat was so intense that the sunlight seemed to sweep across every street with thin blades of fire, coating the tin roofs, the old brick walls, and the rows of vibrantly green trees in the eastern residential neighborhood with a glowing gold layer like dusted honey. Wind blowing from the heart of the Central Valley swept over the dry lawns, carrying the smell of hot earth and the scent of asphalt evaporating under the sun's power. On Stockton Boulevard, classic cars drove by, leaving behind echoing metallic sounds, the engine revs, the screeching brakes, the radio static from an era when FM was still a luxury. At 3:44 p.m., the door of the Sacramento Public Library swung open, and Jenna Morris, a petite but quick 12-year-old girl, stepped out of the shade of the red brick building. Her small backpack hung lopsided on one shoulder, her white t-shirt damp with sweat after an afternoon spent reading. Holding 3 newly borrowed children's books in her arms, Jenna squinted in the harsh sunlight, then stood still for a few seconds as if orienting herself by the sun to decide her route home. She usually chose Maplewood Drive because it was quieter and cooler, but today Jenna seemed to hesitate a little. A boy about 10 years old, standing in front of the nearby corner store, later recalled that he had seen Jenna standing right next to a strange woman. The woman was wearing a thin, dark brown coat, something very odd on such a hot day, long black hair, a wide-brimmed hat, shading nearly her entire face. The boy remembered she bent down to say something to Jenna, but right at that moment, an ice cream truck drove by blasting loud music, so he couldn't hear anything. He only remembered Jenna's eyes looking a bit confused before she quickly turned away. About 10 minutes later, at the end of Maplewood Street, Mrs. Eleanor Tate, 62 years old, was watering her front yard plants when she saw a brown-haired girl riding her bike past. The spray from the hose made her squint, but she was certain she had seen Jenna, the wavy brown hair, the familiar biking posture. She even clearly remembered the crunching sound of the tires as Jenna turned into the narrow alley next to the abandoned house. A house that had its roof partially burned last winter and hadn't been repaired since. Mrs. Tate thought Jenna was taking a shortcut home, so she didn't pay much attention. But a few seconds later, when she looked again, Jenna's small figure had completely disappeared behind the rotting fence. There was no scream, no car sound, no unusual noise at all. Jenna was simply no longer there, as if the girl had silently melted into the Sacramento afternoon sunlight. By nearly 6 p.m., when the sun began pouring reddish-orange light over the rooftops and the tree shadows in the yard stretched into sharp, dark strips, Jenna's mother set dinner on the table. Jenna's chair remained empty. 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, then 30 minutes. The family started calling everywhere. First, the neighbors' houses. No one had seen Jenna. Then her best friend's house. No one knew anything. They called the school, asking if Jenna had joined any after-school activities or been picked up by someone else. No. Every call came back with the same answer. I didn't see Jenna today. By 7:12 p.m., when the air in the house had grown thick and every passing minute felt like it was drowning all hope, Jenna's parents stood in the living room, the rotary phone placed in the middle of the wooden table. They looked at each other, eyes filled with unspoken worry. Then the mother, hands trembling, picked up the receiver. Just a short while later, the call was made. The family officially reported to the police that Jenna Morris, 12 years old, had disappeared without a trace. When the clock hit 8 p.m., the Sacramento heat still clung stubbornly to the pavement, like the breath of a day scorched under the sun. Streetlights flickered on into pale yellow halos, stretching the shadows of tree lines and porch roofs across the concrete, making all of Maplewood Drive look like a hazy painting caught between day and night. Less than 15 minutes after the missing person call, two Sacramento Police Department patrol cars rolled up to the end of the street, parking right in front of Jenna's house. The air inside the home was thick with worry, Jenna's parents' voices breaking as they answered each question the police asked. Lead investigator Sergeant David Holbrook, a man who had handled hundreds of missing persons cases but never took any lightly, stepped into the living room with a thick notebook in hand. He listened carefully while scanning every empty space, every object in the room as if anything could hold a clue. Holbrook asked the family to recount every detail from the start of the day up to the moment they realized Jenna hadn't come home. The mother repeated what she had already said on the phone. Jenna left the library at 3:44 p.m. She should have been home by 4:30, and Jenna never lingered along the way without telling someone first. The more he heard, the faster Holbrook wrote. He began sketching the case's first timeline. 3:44 p.m. leaves library. 3:50 p.m. seen near the corner store on Stockton Boulevard. Around 3:55 p.m. spotted on Maplewood Drive. 4 p.m. last sighting. When he finished writing, he stood still for a few seconds, staring at that chain of times with tense focus. A child missing person case always had a golden hour window, and within that window, every minute was a difference that could easily lead to misdirecting the entire investigation. He asked again, making sure Jenna had never chosen any alternate route home. The mother answered firmly. She always took Fifth Avenue, never changed her route. Yet witnesses said they saw Jenna on Maplewood Drive. Holbrook noted in his book, Jenna did not stick to fixed route, need to verify reason. This made the case immediately more complicated. There was no logical reason for Jenna to deliberately turn onto Maplewood, a detour route, with fewer trees for shade, and completely outside her routine. A 12-year-old rarely changed paths on their own unless someone or something made them alter their decision. At 8:20 p.m., Holbrook and Officer Clark left the house to meet the witnesses who had already spoken to the family. The boy in front of the corner store described again what he had seen. Jenna standing next to a woman wearing a long dark brown coat, an outfit choice far too strange for summer heat. The boy couldn't hear what they said, but he clearly remembered the sound of an engine starting up right after Jenna walked away from that spot. That made Holbrook pause his pen. A vehicle revving up just as Jenna appeared in the alley could be coincidence, but it could also be preparation. He asked the boy to describe the engine sound, and the boy said it was a deep rumble, like the old wagons the neighbors have. That was enough for Holbrook to note. Station wagon check all wagon owners in the area. When they reached the end of Maplewood Drive, Holbrook met Mrs. Eleanor Tate, who had seen Jenna turn into the alley next to the abandoned house. She described the scene so clearly that Holbrook could picture it. Late afternoon sunlight shining on Jenna's hair, tires crunching on dry gravel, then the girl disappearing behind the rotting fence. Mrs. Tate added that she heard a sound like a door closing softly from inside the alley after Jenna vanished. A sound too faint to draw attention at the time, but clear enough to make Holbrook suspect Jenna might have entered an area with structure like a back door or corner wall of the empty house. Holbrook walked into the alley, shining his flashlight on the ground. The soft dirt in the middle of the alley showed something had disturbed the surface. Not obvious, but enough to form a faint, curved line under the light. It could be a tire. It could be footprints. It could be both. He crouched down, lightly touched the soil, then noted, surface disturbed recheck. Overall, this alley was not a place a child would enter on their own without reason. It was dark, narrow, and led toward two abandoned houses from last year's fire. One house still had charred windows, rotted wood exposing the inner framing, not a route neighborhood kids ever used for play. This led Holbrook to mark the alley as hot zone priority area with a 1-mile radius around it. Holbrook ordered Clark to immediately check residents within that radius, see who had prior records, who had ever been reported for unusual behavior around children. Though data back then wasn't stored on computers, the paper files at the station were very complete. Within just 2 hours, they found 4 people in the 1-mile radius with unclean histories. This made the area even more suspicious. At the same time, Halbrook told Clark to collect all film rolls from the traffic cameras near the library and Maplewood. Those mechanical cameras from the 1970s only captured a few frames. But sometimes, those scarce photos recorded the most critical moment of an entire case. As Clark left, Halbrook returned to the middle of the alley, standing motionless as if listening for footsteps from the past. He looked into the darkness between the two houses where Jenna was last seen. Night breeze rustled lightly through the tree leaves, insect sounds mixing with the lingering daytime heat. Halbrook said nothing, but in his mind a thought rang clear as ink on paper. Jenna did not vanish on her own. Someone had entered her path. He closed his notebook. The official investigation was underway, sharp, urgent, and allowed no further delay of even a minute. The sky over Sacramento had turned a deep purple by the time Sergeant David Halbrook returned to the spot where Jenna was last seen. The streetlight at the entrance to the alley had come on, its weak light spilling down onto the ground like a hazy circle, not strong enough to erase the bands of darkness creeping around the two abandoned houses. The lingering hot winds from the day funneled through the charred wall gaps, making the old boards creak like sighs from an aging structure. There was no doubt anymore. The place where Jenna turned in was not a harmless shortcut, but a perfect blind spot, where every sound could be swallowed in just a few seconds. Halbrook opened the 1975 topographic map of Sacramento, the kind printed on thick paper with colored ink marking each block, elevation, and small escape routes of that time. Unlike modern digital maps that zoom in and out freely, topographic maps required the reader to be truly familiar with the urban layout. Halbrook used a ruler and pencil to trace the paths where a mid-size vehicle could still maneuver through the alley without drawing attention. From the alley Jenna entered, there were 3 feasible escape routes: a dirt path running parallel behind the row of houses, leading out to the main road, a narrow lane behind the burned house once used for garbage trucks in previous years, and a steep, narrow slope connecting to an empty lot to the east. All 3 routes formed an ideal corridor for anyone wanting to leave the area undetected. This further reinforced the conclusion that Jenna hadn't simply taken a wrong turn. Halbrook shone his flashlight on the ground again. The signs that had been faint in daylight now stood out more clearly under the focused beam. A curved groove in the soil like a tire making a slight turn. Several patches of grass pressed down at an angle, and right against the wall of the second house, a patch of ground that looked freshly compressed not long ago. He knelt down, gently parting the thin layers of soil with his fingers. The dirt was still soft, proof it had been disturbed within the last few hours, right around the time Jenna entered the alley. Next to that soil mark, Halbrook spotted an adult footprint. The print wasn't deep like a quick step, but clear enough to confirm it belonged to an adult moving fast. What caught his attention wasn't the footprint itself, but a smaller one slightly offset behind it, as if the adult had been dragging or holding something, or someone. This smaller mark was light and shallow, but the even spacing of the steps showed it wasn't someone running away. It looked more like the footprints of a child being led rather than running on their own. Halbrook carefully measured the size, just as he feared. It closely matched Jenna's foot size. The air in the alley seemed to thicken. Halbrook stood up, staring toward the end of the alley where the darkness was densest, like a black maw that had swallowed Jenna's figure in seconds. He replayed it all in his mind. Jenna walking in here. Someone standing at the blind spot between the two houses. That person grabbing Jenna's hand or holding her shoulder, then leading Jenna along the alley in the direction the footprints pointed, and then they vanished down one of the 3 escape routes. It all happened fast, clean, silent. That showed the perpetrator had planned, or at least knew the area's layout well. Officer Clark, checking behind the first house, called Halbrook over. At the base of the wall where the bricks were roughened by last year's fire, trash had been piled into a small clump. Crumpled tissue, an old cigarette pack, a piece of plastic hardened by the sun. But at the bottom, Halbrook saw something noteworthy. A small tear mark in the ground, as if someone had dug their heel in hard and spun around suddenly. This was the kind of mark left by someone changing direction rather than walking straight. If the perpetrator was holding Jenna's hand, this could be the point where the adult turned to shield Jenna from view of anyone looking in from the street. Halbrook noted in his book, Movement pattern. Starts mid-alley, turns toward back of burned house. He stepped up to the back door of the once burned house. Charred wooden frame. Part of the roof collapsed, but the back door wasn't locked with a key. It was only blocked by a piece of wood propped at an angle. When Halbrook pushed lightly, the door shifted less than an inch but let out a creaky metallic hinge sound. He stopped. Mrs. Tate had said she heard a soft door slam. So this door had very likely been used, not today, then in the days before. Halbrook shone his flashlight through the gap. Inside was pitch black, the lingering smell of smoke from the fire mixed with dust and thick cobwebs. He saw muddy shoe prints on the wooden floor, stretching from the door inward and toward the back of the room where a narrow passage led straight out to the dirt road behind. That matched the second escape route the topographic map had shown. The adult could have led Jenna through the house to exit onto the back dirt road, completely avoiding sightlines from both sides of the alley. Halbrook felt his heart skip a cold beat. The fact that the perpetrator knew this layout so well meant they had been in the area before or lived nearby. A stranger would have a hard time using such a quick escape unless they had scouted it in advance. Officer Clark reported more. From the broken bricks and leftover ash, there were several uneven impressions, as if two people had stepped in the same area while moving quickly. One heavy adult track, one light small child track. The two sets overlapped multiple times, showing both had moved in sync at nearly the same moment. The investigative atmosphere inside this ruined house grew heavy and tense, almost palpable on the skin. This was no longer speculation. Every clue from the map, the footprints, to the escape routes was closing in on one simple but horrifying conclusion. Jenna did not leave that alley alone, and the person who took her knew exactly which path to lead her down to avoid detection. Halbrook closed his notebook, sighing into the thick darkness. The case had shifted from a lost child to a deliberate abduction. And now, every beat of the investigation was a race against time. Night had fallen completely by the time Sergeant David Halbrook returned to Maplewood Drive for the second round of witness interviews. The pale yellow streetlights combined with the lingering heat made the neighborhood feel like a silent ship drifting through darkness. The investigator knew well that in child disappearance cases, initial witnesses often provided vague, conflicting, or memory-distorted information. But the contradictions this time were not just simple mistakes. They created three versions so different they were almost opposites. And Halbrook's task was to peel back each layer of testimony to find the single truth that could match the physical evidence in the alley and the tightening timeline. He and Officer Clark knocked on doors one by one, starting at the corner store, moving to the ground floor apartment across from the library, then to Mrs. Tate's small house. In total, 7 witnesses claimed to have seen Jenna that afternoon. But when Halbrook lined up their statements, he saw immediately that they could not all be correct. The first witness, the boy standing in front of the corner store, said he saw Jenna with a strange woman wearing a long, dark brown coat, black hair covering most of her face. He emphasized, "I'm sure she was talking to Jenna." Halbrook had heard this before, but in a calmer setting this time. The boy described it more clearly. The woman bent down to Jenna's level, standing so close it was like she was blocking the girl's path. The boy remembered her standing motionless for a few seconds, then Jenna turning away with a slightly tense expression. Not a friendly chat. He said, "I think Jenna wanted to get away." The second witness, a man living in the apartment opposite the library, told a completely different story. He said he saw Jenna walking with a man in a flannel shirt and a baseball cap. The man was walking very close to Jenna, as if guiding or protecting her. When Halbrook asked if he got a clear look at the man's face, the witness replied, "No, the sunlight was behind him, so I only saw the silhouette." The investigator noted it, but immediately compared it mentally to the topographic map. The route the second witness described did not match the direction Jenna turned toward Maplewood. If she was really with a man, they would have been going the opposite way from the alley. The third witness, Mrs. Eleanor Tate, insisted she saw Jenna alone. She clearly saw the bicycle, the brown hair, the way Jenna pedaled slowly as she approached the alley. She said, the girl wasn't looking to the side, wasn't talking to anyone. She seemed focused on the road. This was a direct contradiction to the first two statements. Halbrook gathered all three testimonies and compared them in his ink-filled notebook. One picture could not simultaneously feature a woman walking beside her, a man accompanying her, and Jenna completely alone. At least two statements had to be wrong, or one deliberately false. As he expanded the interviews to the fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh witnesses, the contradictions grew more complex. Some said they saw the figure of a man walking a few steps behind Jenna. Others said the alley was empty when Jenna turned in. Another was certain they saw someone standing in the shadows of the burned house, but couldn't remember if it was a man or a woman. Halbrook did not rush to challenge any statement. He understood witness psychology. When many people talk, their memories easily latch onto details from others. He returned to each key point in the timeline. From 3:50 to 3:55 p.m., Jenna was seen on Stockton Boulevard. From there to the Maplewood Alley took less than 3 minutes. There was not enough time for Jenna to be with two different people going in two different directions. Therefore, one of the statements was wrong from the start. Halbrook went back to the second witness, the man who said he saw Jenna with the flannel-shirted man. This man lived alone, his door cluttered with newspapers and empty bottles. A few photos of old trucks hanging in the room. When Halbrook pressed for more detail about the exact time he saw Jenna, the witness grew uncertain. Maybe around 3, or maybe later. I didn't check the clock. Halbrook sensed the looseness immediately. He changed his tone. Have you ever had trouble with the police over something like this? The man flinched slightly. Halbrook continued. We need the truth. No one will charge you for being mistaken, but if you're deliberately giving false information, that could delay finding the child. The man's eyes shifted. Then he sighed and lowered his head. I'm not sure. The girl I saw was Jenna. I just wanted to help. Halbrook understood the reason instantly. Many witnesses like to be the one who knows something, and unintentionally or deliberately embellish their memory. This statement was removed from the timeline. Another case was the seventh witness, the one who said they saw a figure standing in the darkness of the burned house. When Halbrook questioned her again, she hesitated for a moment, then admitted she had been arguing with her husband at that time and hadn't actually looked out the window. She had only guessed because she heard others talking. That left only two statements as the most reliable. The boy's account of Jenna standing next to the strange woman, and Mrs. Tate's account of Jenna biking alone before turning into the alley. These two did not contradict each other. Jenna could have encountered the woman first, then separated and continued alone to Maplewood. This fit both the timeline and the footprints in the alley. Halbrook wrote the final 3 points into the timeline. 3:48 p.m. Jenna standing next to a strange woman. 3:55 p.m. Jenna biking alone on Maplewood Drive. 4 p.m. Jenna disappears in the alley, next to the burned house. When he finished writing those 3 lines, the air seemed to still. All the contradictions, noise, and shaky memories had finally narrowed into one clear timeline, and the most terrifying part was that very clarity showed the window in which Jenna vanished was exactly 5 minutes. 5 minutes. A span too short for a 12-year-old child to disappear on her own, but long enough for a prepared adult to take Jenna out of the area without making a sound. Halbrook closed his notebook, feeling a heaviness spread down his spine. The question was no longer, who was Jenna with, but who was waiting for her in the alley, and why did that person appear at the exact moment Jenna changed her route? The timeline had been tightened, and every link pointed to the same place. The pitch-black alley between the 2 burned houses, where an adult's shadow and a child's footprints overlapped like an undeniable truth. The next morning, Sacramento sunlight poured down on Maplewood Drive again like a fresh coat of golden paint. But instead of brightening the neighborhood, it only made every detail of the scene reveal more suspicious empty spaces. Halbrook and the investigation team returned to the alley with a crime scene analyst to scan for small pieces of evidence they might have missed the night before. Experience had taught Halbrook that in disappearances like this, evidence wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was just a tiny detail out of place. A scratch, an object, misplaced things the perpetrator thought harmless, but that could become the key. As the team spread out to check the area around the alley, a young officer called Halbrook over. On the grass right next to the broken fence, directly opposite where Mrs. Tate had seen Jenna pass by, there was a book lying face down, its cover still dusted lightly. Halbrook crouched and picked it up with gloved hands. It was one of the 3 books Jenna had borrowed yesterday, exact title and exact Sacramento Public Library stamp. The book looked almost brand new, no water damage or signs of being thrown hard to the ground. This made Halbrook pause for a few seconds, thinking, if Jenna had dropped the book while biking, or being pulled forcefully, it should have skid marks, scratches, or bent corners. But there were none. The book was placed neatly right at the edge of the grass, not shifted onto the dry dirt and not tilted into the alley. It was in a position too perfect, as if someone had set it down gently, not dropped during a struggle. Halbrook examined the ground beneath the book. The soil right next to it showed no depression or compression proof. The book hadn't fallen hard from height. He used a marker to note yesterday's wind direction from recorded data, blowing from southwest to northeast. If the book had fallen from Jenna's backpack while she was moving, the wind would have pushed it in another direction, not left it settled neatly at the grass edge like this. The book's position showed it wasn't accidentally dropped, but placed deliberately, possibly by Jenna in panic, or by someone else to mislead. At the grass edge about 1 meter away, a faint tire mark stood out clearer in daylight. The ground yesterday had been soft from leaking water, so the imprint was shallow but enough to identify it as a small, old tire type belonging to a rear single-axle vehicle common on station wagons or older sedans. Halbrook measured the imprint diameter with a ruler, then noted the measurements in his book. From the depth, slide direction, and shape, the tire appeared to have turned slightly before veering right toward the burned houses. Clark brought over a backpack the police had found last night, about 30 yards from the book's location. The backpack had been discovered pressed under the base of a bush cluster, not lying out in the open in the alley. One look confirmed it was Jenna's light pink color, zipper pull with a star charm exactly as the family described. When opening the backpack to check what was inside, one detail caught Halbrook's attention immediately. On the strap, caught in the fabric, was a long black hair strand, completely different from Jenna's brown hair. The hair was tangled in the part of the strap that would sit against Jenna's neck and shoulder when worn. This showed someone had made direct close contact with the backpack in a way that left the trace. Halbrook placed the hair strand in an evidence bag, then examined the backpack closely. At the bottom, there were a few grains of pale gray dust, different from the alley's soil color. He touched the dust layer, rubbing it lightly between his fingers, fine, dry, and seemingly the type of soil from behind the burned house rather than the front alley. This fit the theory that Jenna or her backpack had been taken through the abandoned house, a route the perpetrator could use to avoid being seen. The next trace was found at the edge of the charred wall of the first house. A small patch of soil flipped up as if something heavy had been placed, then dragged away. From that point extending outward was a thin soil streak in a gentle curve, heading straight toward the back dirt road. This curved streak didn't resemble wind-blown or animal-made marks. It looked like something dragged while slightly tilted. If it was a tire, it wasn't from a car but similar to the position of a bicycle's front wheel being held off to one side, or hurriedly walked. Halbrook wrote in his notebook, "Bicycle was in this position before being moved." Jenna turning into the alley and vanishing afterward was now connected more clearly to the chain of evidence movement. Jenna's backpack behind the alley, the book outside the alley like something deliberately left, tire marks suggesting a vehicle may have been waiting near the burned houses, and the drag mark implying the bicycle was walked toward the back rather than abandoned at the front, as initially thought. Each piece alone couldn't explain everything, but all together they pointed in one direction. Jenna hadn't moved randomly. Every movement showed adult intervention, from the clean book to the black hair, from the old tire mark to the gray dust in the backpack. Everything formed a hazy but connected picture of deliberate action, not accident. As Halbrook stood in the middle of the alley again, the fresh sunlight illuminated every soil mark that last night he had only seen faintly, and he felt the gravity of what was emerging. The person who took Jenna seemed to know the terrain well, knew where the blind spots were, where no one would notice. and knew how to erase traces just enough to confuse without covering everything. The case was no longer about, where did Jenna go? But had shifted to a far more frightening question. Who arranged this route for her? The presence of the hair, the moved backpack, and the neatly placed book like a message showed the perpetrator didn't just act quickly, but calmly. And that very calmness turned the alley between the two burned houses into the central point of a mysterious disappearance that Halbrook knew would lead them much farther than the few streets around Maplewood Drive. Later that morning, as soon as the new evidence was logged, Halbrook returned to the library to interview everyone who had been present around the time Jenna left. If someone had caused Jenna to change her route, that person most likely appeared near the library before the girl biked toward Maplewood Drive. The library staff, mostly middle-aged women, all said they noticed nothing unusual, except for one detail. A black-haired woman, in a long dark brown coat, about 5 feet 3 inches tall, standing outside the library entrance for a long while before stepping inside just a few minutes before Jenna headed home. This woman did not check out any books, did not ask anything, only wandered between the shelves, then stood near the exit area. One of the staff clearly remembered that she kept looking outside, as if waiting for someone, and this appearance matched perfectly with the boy's statement about seeing Jenna standing next to the strange woman in front of the corner store. Halbrook immediately went to the library security guard for more details about her appearance. The guard recalled an important detail. The shoes the woman wore were stiff, high-top leather ones, commonly sold in second-hand stores, a style not common among women in 1975. Her walk leaned slightly to the right, as if she had a hip issue or was carrying something heavy in her coat pocket. Every small detail was fully noted by Halbrook. When checking the list of people frequently seen around the library in the past 3 months, police discovered the name Miriam Brookdale, 38 years old, address 3 blocks from the library. Records showed Miriam was unemployed, lived alone in a ground-floor apartment, had a history of mild psychological instability, but no criminal record. However, there was one report from 2 weeks earlier at Riverbend Park. A black-haired woman in a long, dark brown coat, described very similarly to Miriam, had approached a group of children and tried to engage in inappropriate conversation. Parents reported it to police out of concern, but since there was no clear criminal act, the matter ended with only a warning. This immediately made Miriam stand out on the suspect list. Halbrook and Clark decided to knock on Miriam's apartment door that same afternoon. The door opened slowly, and the woman behind it matched the library description perfectly. Black hair, slightly thin build, and heavy eyes, as if carrying something uncomfortable. When she saw the police, she flinched briefly but quickly composed herself. The apartment was small and cluttered, but not excessively so. A faint, musty smell hung in the air. Halbrook asked permission to look around, and Miriam agreed reluctantly. There was something in the way she watched Halbrook that put Clark on alert, as if she was assessing what they would see. In the living room, nothing stood out, just piles of old magazines, unwashed cups and dishes, and a few boxes scattered around. But when Clark opened the wooden wardrobe in the corner of the bedroom, he stopped. Inside, neatly stacked on the shelf, was a series of children's clothing. Small dresses, t-shirts, shorts, mostly used but washed clean and folded carefully. None of the items would fit an adult. This wardrobe could not be mistaken. Clark looked at Halbrook, then at Miriam. Miriam immediately explained, "I volunteer at a second-hand store. I bring clothes home to sort them further. It's nothing special." The answer was calm but unnatural. Halbrook followed up, "Do you know Jenna Morris?" Miriam shook her head right away, eyes directed at the floor. When Halbrook asked what she had done on the afternoon of June 14th, Miriam said she had stayed home alone the whole time. But when Clark stepped outside to ask neighbors, a man living next door said Miriam had left the apartment for about half an hour that afternoon, exactly the time Jenna left the library. She carried no purse, but returned with her shoes covered in gray dust, the same kind as the soil behind the burned houses. Halbrook faced Miriam again, and this time asked directly, "Where did you go that day?" Miriam was silent for a long while before saying, "I went to the park for some fresh air." This answer did not match the dirt on her shoes, because the park did not have the distinctive gray soil from the burned houses area. The apartment showed no trace of Jenna. No belongings, photos, or anything related to Jenna. No signs of disturbance or evidence Jenna had ever been there. The children's wardrobe was the most unusual detail, but also the hardest to conclude. It could be harmless, or it could signal dangerous behavior. Halbrook requested to examine Miriam's shoes. The soles had gray dirt stuck in the treads, exactly the type found on Jenna's backpack. But that dirt could come from many places in the area, not strong enough for charges. Then Halbrook asked the most important question. "Did you ever speak to Jenna?" Miriam looked down. Silent, far too long. When she looked up, her answer hesitated. I did see the girl outside the library, but I didn't say anything." This answer did not match the boy's statement. When Halbrook pointed that out, Miriam took half a step back, confusion clearly showing. In the end, to avoid missing any chance of finding Jenna when every minute mattered, Halbrook took Miriam's official statement, but did not arrest her. He noted clearly in the file, no sign of Jenna. Indications of unusual behavior, continued surveillance required. Miriam had a partial alibi. A neighbor saw her return home before the time Jenna vanished from the alley, but it was not clear enough to fully rule her out. Her alibi was only relative, not solid. As they stepped out of the apartment, Clark said quietly, "Do you think she's involved?" Halbrook looked down at the folded map in his hand and replied, "I don't know, but there's something I can't ignore." And as he looked back toward the road leading to the library, the image of the woman in the long coat standing silently in 104-degree heat still lingered like the dark shadow that began the chain of events, leading Jenna to the alley between the two burned houses. If Miriam was not the one who led Jenna into the alley, then why did she appear at every overlapping point? And if Miriam truly was innocent, then who really was the woman in the first witness statement? Though suspicion toward the black-haired woman continued to grow, Halbrook could not ignore the second witness's statement, the one who insisted he saw Jenna walking with a man in a flannel shirt and a baseball cap, staying very close to the girl, as if guiding her. Even though that statement later revealed many uncertainties, Halbrook knew that in child disappearances, dismissing a possibility too early could send the investigation off track for months, even years. So he decided to open a separate investigative branch focused on the flannel-shirted man, despite the high likelihood that the witness had remembered wrongly. Halbrook began by reviewing the list of residents within a 1-mile radius of Maplewood Drive, especially middle-aged men, aged 30 to 50, whose build matched the description. 1975 had no automated data, so all information had to be searched manually through paper files. Halbrook and Clark sat in the office, pulling out folder after folder from old metal cabinets. The rustle of paper and the clank of metal hinges against each other created a steady rhythm, like the breathing of the investigation room. After 6 straight hours of searching, they identified 5 men in the area who regularly wore flannel shirts, the type common among working-class or freelance men at that time. Of these 5, 3 had clear alibis, working at an auto repair shop, a lumber store, or a transport company at the time Jenna vanished. The 4th was a high school teacher, confirmed by students and colleagues to have been supervising the basketball club at school that afternoon. The last one, Stanley Hargrove, 44 years old, made the file pause longer than usual. Stanley lived in a wooden house on the edge of Maplewood, quite close to the alley where Jenna turned in. Records showed he had moved from Nevada to California 3 years earlier. The detail that made Halbrook stop writing was a faint note in the Nevada file. Investigated in connection with missing child case, insufficient evidence to prosecute. That brief notation made the air in the room thicken. Halbrook immediately called the Washoe County Sheriff's Office in Nevada. The other end answered after a few rings. An older officer explained that in 1968, a 7-year-old boy disappeared near Reno. Several witnesses said they saw the boy talking to a man in a flannel shirt. Hargrove, who worked nearby at the time, was investigated for being in the area around that time. However, there was no physical evidence, no direct witnesses, and no DNA back then to link him to the case. Public pressure also faded quickly, and the case drifted into oblivion. Stanley left Nevada shortly afterward, moving to California to start a new life. No one followed up on him. Halbrook frowned. A person once investigated in a child disappearance now living right next to the scene where Jenna vanished, this was too suspicious to ignore. He and Clark immediately went to knock on Stanley's door late that afternoon. As the sunlight stretched long shadows across the dry lawn, the door opened to reveal a tall, broad man with graying hair, deep and slightly distant eyes. He was wearing exactly the kind of flannel shirt described by the witness. The faint smell of wood, engine oil, and cigarette smoke hung in the air. When Halbrook mentioned Jenna's disappearance, Stanley appeared surprised but not overly defensive. He spoke in a low, somewhat tired voice. "I don't know anything about it. I was at the warehouse all afternoon." Clark asked further. "Can anyone confirm you were there?" Stanley thought for a few seconds, then said, "My boss can confirm. I worked until 5. Halbrook noted this point but did not jump to conclusions. While Clark continued talking, Halbrook scanned the surroundings. On the dining table were the morning newspaper, uneaten food, and an open wooden toolbox. Everything in the house suggested a man living alone, not tidy, but with no obvious signs of concealment. Halbrook asked permission to check Stanley's shoes. The man agreed immediately, even bringing out 2 other pairs for them to examine if needed. The soles showed no gray dirt like the soil around the burned houses, an important detail that made Halbrook temporarily step back from his initial suspicion. When asked more about the previous afternoon, Stanley emphasized that he had not left work during the window when Jenna disappeared. When Halbrook called to verify, Stanley's statement was confirmed by his boss. He had indeed worked until 5 p.m. without leaving the warehouse. Even so, Halbrook still wanted to check Stanley's route home. The distance between the warehouse and Maplewood Drive was considerable. He would have driven a small truck, and the route passed through busy areas. No one reported seeing his truck near the alley around the time Jenna vanished. This made the theory that Stanley was the flannel-shirted man almost untenable. After more than an hour of conversation, Halbrook realized one clear thing. Stanley's height was far too tall compared to the original witness description. The boy had said the man was only a little taller than Jenna, while Stanley was nearly 6 feet tall. This was a detail that could not be explained by ordinary confusion. As they left Stanley's house, Clark said quietly, "He cooperated too much, but I didn't see anything connected to Jenna." Halbrook nodded. If he were involved, it wouldn't be this clean. He made the final note. Stanley Hargrove. Prior investigation in past. No current evidence. Temporarily cleared, but requires indirect monitoring. Returning to the Maplewood Alley, Halbrook looked at the path where Jenna was last seen. The statements had been sorted. The flannel-shirted man almost certainly a misremembering. The black-haired woman too many matching points to ignore. And Jenna alone confirmed by Mrs. Tate, the most reliable witness. This led Halbrook to a new inference. Jenna had encountered someone before turning into the alley, but by the time she reached the spot where people saw her, she was alone. That meant the person who approached Jenna had separated before she biked toward the alley, or had indirectly guided her to go that way. Though the flannel-shirted man was not a suspect, his appearance in the statement still gave Halbrook one thing. Witness memories could be distorted by the silhouettes of others present in the area at the same time, and that made tracing the perpetrator's actual behavior even harder. But Halbrook was not discouraged. One wrong witness could derail an investigation, but 7 statements layered together even when conflicting still drew a map of the truth. And that map was starting to narrow, centering on a single person, the black-haired woman. Summer passed without any progress. In the early days, Halbrook still received dozens of calls, reporting sighting a girl resembling Jenna at supermarkets, parks, or on buses, but all led to dead ends. Each time a lead was checked, silence returned like a black curtain closing over every possibility. When the first autumn leaves fell, Maplewood Drive gradually returned to normal life, though residents near the alley still glanced over whenever any child passed by. The string-tight tension of the first weeks began to ease, and then, over time, something else took its place. Exhaustion. Even so, Halbrook did not give up. He continued working along separate lines, remotely monitoring Miriam, rechecking every old file box, rescanning the entire route Jenna had taken. But every effort circled back to the starting point. The black-haired woman vanished from the area. The flannel-shirted man confirmed alibi. The traces in the alley no further development due to the lack of microscopic analysis technology that would come many years later. By the end of 1976, the Jenna Morris case was officially shifted from active investigation to monitoring and updates, a euphemism for placing the case in limbo. From 1977 to 1980, the Sacramento police handled more new cases, more urgent, more brutal ones. Jenna's case gradually sank to the bottom of the priority list. The evidence boxes containing the backpack, the black hair strand, the book, sketches of the black-haired woman, were moved to storage behind headquarters. At that time, storage was far from ideal. No stable air conditioning, temperatures fluctuating with the seasons, and many items placed in ordinary cardboard boxes. The black hair strand, one of the most crucial pieces of evidence, was sealed in an old generation plastic bag, prone to oxidation over time. Even the soil stuck in Jenna's backpack dried out, crumbled, and lost its original structure for analysis. Advances in forensic technology, especially DNA, had not yet emerged. In 1978, Halbrook proposed sending the hair strand to an out-of-state lab, but the result came back only as insufficient technique to determine. The case's most important evidence had to remain dormant in storage, like proof of an era not yet capable of saving missing children. By 1982, the Jenna case was officially classified as a cold case. The 3-inch thick file, its paperclip corners worn, was placed in drawer number 4, row C, where unsolved disappearances with no remaining leads were kept. A yellow label was affixed to the cover, closed. Review only if new evidence arises. Those words were like a cold confirmation that after 7 years, police no longer knew where to go next. But not everyone on the investigative team believed the case had reached its end. In the case file, 1982 saw the signature of a newly transferred detective, Detective Alan Merrick. Known for his sharp intuition and meticulous note-taking habits, when assigned to review the Jenna case as part of routine training, Merrick spent many days reading the entire file from beginning to end, and it was he who noticed something that haunted him. There was no evidence Jenna had left the alley in danger, only traces showing she was led away, but no signs proving Jenna had been killed. This led Merrick to write in the file a line that later became a question hanging unresolved for decades. KM82. No explanation, no accompanying documents. Just 2 letters and 2 numbers, written in blue ink on the margin of page 14 in the summary report. Shortly afterward, Merrick was reassigned to another high-priority case. When he returned to the Jenna file a few months later, he unexpectedly died in a traffic accident. The note, KM82, was never elaborated on. In the records room, those faint letters lay silent among hundreds of other pages, known only to Merrick what they referred to. Initials? A location code? A message? Or a year Merrick believed Jenna was still alive until then? No one knew, and no one asked anymore. From 1983 to 1985, the Jenna case was reviewed 3 times under periodic check regulations, but each time reached the same conclusion. No new evidence, no new statements, no new witnesses. Everything stopped at the alley between the 2 burned houses, where the adult shoe prints and Jenna's small footprints still lingered in the memory of those who had seen them in the case's early days. For nearly a decade, the Jenna Morris file slept quietly in the metal cabinet, where the traces had begun degrading over time. The backpack faded. The hair strand became brittle. The soil crumbs lost their originality. Everything gradually turned into framed fragments of memory, unable to salvage the truth without new technology. But strangely, whenever a young officer happened to open that file drawer, the line KM82 still evoked an indescribable feeling like a question still owed an answer. No one knew what Detective Merrick had seen in the file, but the existence of that note was the only thing showing that someone, at that time, still believed Jenna had never left this life in the way everyone thought. The case froze completely, but the file was not silent. It still lay there waiting for technology, waiting for people, and waiting for the right moment to be reopened. In 1986, more than a decade after the day Jenna Morris vanished, the Sacramento Police Department launched a program to review old missing persons cases in an attempt to apply newly emerging investigative methods in terrain analysis and urban spatial profiling. The program was internally called Project ARC, short for Analytical Route Comparison, a technique using old topographic maps, planning maps, and demographic data to reconstruct possible movement routes of victims and perpetrators. When Jenna's file was pulled from the cold metal cabinet, the label still bearing the yellow closed mark, all eyes turned to the strange note left by Detective Merrick in 1982, KM 82. No one knew what Merrick meant, but the reinvestigation team believed the note must relate to movement direction, because KM, in old coding, was sometimes used to mark kilometer markers on topographic maps. This prompted Hal Brook, now promoted to criminal supervision rank, to join the new review directly, even though he had not touched the Jenna case in nearly 10 years. The new ARC maps, overlaying 1975 terrain layers, 1980 planning maps, and vehicle corridor maps from the 1970s, were spread across the table like a maze. Hal Brook and the younger investigation team began comparing the alley where Jenna disappeared with the 3 original feasible escape routes. When combining factors like tree density, obstruction from old structures, and changes over the years, they noticed something noteworthy. The dirt road behind the 2 burned houses in 1975 had once been a garbage truck lane, but from 1978, it was demolished and merged into a new residential area. That meant at the time Jenna vanished, this escape route was highly convenient for an old truck or car to reach the main road without being spotted. Though ARC revealed a suitable escape path, it offered no next direction. If the perpetrator led Jenna to the dirt road, the question remained, where did they take her? While reviewing old files, a young investigator named Carter found a loose note tucked in the file folder, seemingly accidentally stapled when the files were packed in 1976. It contained 2 typed lines. Inquiry received from Medford, Oregon. Unidentified girl admitted 1980, no matching records. Beside the typed lines was an old officer's handwriting. No link to Sacramento case at this time. This detail made the entire investigation room pause for several seconds. An unidentified girl admitted to a hospital in Oregon in 1980, exactly 5 years after Jenna's disappearance. The timing strangely matched Merrick's note, KM 82 kilometers, possibly a route marker, and 82 the year he believed Jenna was still alive. No one knew for sure, but the coincidence was too strong for Hal Brook to ignore. The ARC team immediately contacted major and minor hospitals in Medford and all of Jackson County, Oregon. The calls lasted hours. Some hospitals kept excellent records. Others had merged into new systems with incomplete old files. But by the end of that week, they confirmed that St. Mary's Hospital in Medford had indeed admitted a girl aged around 12 to 14 in the spring of 1980. The record only stated, no ID, quiet, non-responsive. The girl did not know her own name, remembered no hometown, and provided no information about family. The problem was that those records were now sealed under laws protecting the identity of missing or abandoned minors. To access them required a court order or compelling evidence linking it to a criminal investigation. And with Jenna's case still a cold case lacking legal momentum, every request for access was denied. The faded 1980 records became a closed door. No one knew who that girl was, where she came from, or where she went after hospitalization. The file only noted she was transferred to a local foster facility after 1 month of treatment. And from there, she vanished completely. Hal Brook felt his old blood surge again like in 1975. He wondered if Merrick, the only one who ever believed Jenna was alive, had seen this information when it was sent to Sacramento years earlier. Could KM82 be the code Merrick used to remind himself that in 1982, there was still a chance Jenna had been found somewhere else? Carter suggested requesting a warrant to access the sealed records. But in 1986, that was nearly impossible. Judges at the time did not consider connecting two unrelated cases sufficient reason to unseal juvenile documents, especially without physical evidence or proof Jenna had ever left California. The ARC reinvestigation, though it opened many new directions, ultimately could not overcome legal barriers and data shortages. By the end of 1987, ARC concluded its trial phase without any breakthrough for Jenna's case. The file was returned to the old cabinet. KM82 continued to lie silent, a note no one understood. But no one could bring themselves to erase. From 1988 to 1997, the case underwent 3 regulatory reviews, but each reached the same conclusion. Evidence degrading, witnesses no longer remembering accurately, no new suspect behavior, and the 1980 Oregon hospital case unverifiable. A few young investigators tried connecting demographic data, but they all failed against the reality that no one knew the name of the girl admitted in 1980, where she appeared from, or who she ultimately became. By the end of 1997, Jenna's case fell silent again. Once more, the file cabinet closed. But this time, it was not just closing the cabinet, it was closing it on a secret no one yet understood. Because throughout those 20 years, no one knew that in Oregon, the records of the unidentified girl admitted in 1980 still lay there, sealed, waiting for a different generation of technology to unlock them. The case cooled again, but it did not die. It simply sank to the bottom of the drawer, waiting for the right moment to come alive once more. Nearly half a century had passed since the day Jenna Morris vanished, and the case seemed to exist only in a few faded lines in storage. But in 2023, the Sacramento Police Department launched a large-scale program to digitize all case files and evidence from the 1960s through the 1990s, aiming for long-term data preservation and support for modern analytical technologies. Though not a top priority, Jenna's file was still pulled from the old rusty metal cabinet, its peeling paint showing years without human touch. The digitization team laid out each evidence box on the table. Yellowed plastic bags holding dry soil, the brittle black hair strand, witness interview transcripts typed on old typewriters, and the faded ARC topographic maps. When they reached the last box, a thin brown envelope with no markings except a faded handwritten note, evidence unprocessed, lay pressed at the bottom as if forgotten for decades. No one on the team remembered this evidence. There was no note in the file mentioning it, no matching code in the inventory list. But per procedure, every envelope had to be opened in the presence of at least 2 members. When the envelope was cut open, a Polaroid photo gently fell onto the table. Halbrook, now retired but invited back as a consultant because he was the last person who knew every detail of the case, stepped closer and examined the photo carefully. The Polaroid showed a girl sitting in a car, window closed, sunlight reflecting so her face was not clear, but long brown hair reaching her shoulders and a posture like a 10 to 14-year-old were visible. The girl turned her face slightly to the right, eyes looking out the window, as if watching someone or signaled by someone to stay quiet. There was no date stamped on the back, no context to identify the location. But what silenced the room was brown hair, the exact color of Jenna's in 1975. Though no one could conclude for sure, everyone felt a chill run down their spine. Halbrook held the photo under bright white light. The image was overexposed in the upper corner, common when Polaroids were taken quickly or with strong reflecting light. But he noticed a strange detail. On the car window glass, right in front of the girl's face, there was a faint shadow like a person's silhouette. When he brought the photo closer, the detail became clearer. Part of an adult's face reflected on the glass. It was not the girl but a man, apparently standing close to the door, slightly bent down, as if talking or giving an order from outside the car. The photo was immediately sent to the image analysis unit. The tech team asked Halbrook, "Was this photo in the original file?" Halbrook breathed slowly, searching his memories from years ago. "No, I've never seen it. If it had appeared back then, I could never have forgotten it." The entire records room fell silent. A crucial piece of evidence overlooked for 48 years, no one knew why. To date the photo, the tech unit examined the Polaroid film type. Faint lettering on the back showed it was film produced between 1974 and 1978. That meant the picture was likely taken only within a few years around Jenna's disappearance. The chills spread through the room. Who took this photo? Why was it never entered into the file from the start? And was that girl Jenna? The digitization team enlarged the photo using a high-resolution scanner. At 300% zoom, the reflection on the glass became slightly clearer. It was the left half of a man's face. Slightly protruding chin, short hair, broad forehead. Not enough to identify, but enough to know it was not a random shadow. More importantly, the man appeared to be holding the camera. This thickened the air in the room. An adult standing close to the car door, shooting inward. This could not be an innocent family snapshot. The photo was immediately sent to the State Digital Forensics Lab for processing with modern technology, enhancing contrast, separating light layers, analyzing the curved glass reflection to try reconstructing the man's features. While waiting, Halbrook continued examining the envelope. At the bottom was a grain of gray dust stuck there, the color matching the soil found on Jenna's backpack. Halbrook placed the two soil samples side by side, and though he could not conclude by eye alone, the color and grain were nearly identical. That meant the envelope may have once been in the same area, or held evidence from the 1975 scene. The next question echoed in Halbrook's mind. Who placed this envelope in the evidence box without logging it? Who, and why was this evidence never processed? A young officer suggested it might have been misplaced during file handovers between 1976 and 1980, or misfiled during storage reorganizations common, when personnel changed frequently. But Halbrook did not believe that was the only reason. He remembered Merrick, the detective who wrote KM82, had a habit of separating clues without enough data to avoid premature judgment. This envelope could have been part of Merrick's system, or it could be that another officer saw the photo but did not know how to handle it, set it aside, and from then on, it was forgotten. Whatever the reason, the Polaroid had now become one of the most important clues ever found in the case. As the photo was sent for analysis, Halbrook stood alone in the records room, looking at the original under pale fluorescent light. He did not know if the girl in the picture was Jenna. But one thing he knew for sure. The man reflected in the glass was not a passerby. It was a presence. And that presence, though only fleeting in the foggy glass layer, was enough to shatter the near half-century silence of the Jenna Morris case. From that moment, the case was no longer a forgotten cold case. It was being awakened by a photo no one knew had lain silent in the dark for so long. As the Polaroid was sent for analysis, the investigation team simultaneously reopened all biological evidence from the case, especially the black hair strand stuck on Jenna's backpack strap in 1975. Nearly 50 years had passed, and the hair sample had degraded severely. The cuticle oxidized, surface DNA almost deformed. But with 2023 technology, particularly Othrum's forensic-grade genome sequencing, FGGS, even a degraded hair could yield data never before possible. The hair was sealed in a secure container and shipped via specialized transport to Othrum's laboratory in Texas, known for decoding DNA from evidence thought impossible to analyze. When the sample arrived, Halbrook, now only a consultant, but his mind still tied to the Jenna case, received a confirmation email and an estimated timeline. 4 to 6 weeks to extract clean enough SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, data for genealogical analysis. Those were the longest 6 weeks for everyone still invested in the case. During that time, the Polaroid was being processed in parallel, and Halbrook knew that if the DNA yielded a lead, the two investigative streams would merge into one. When the call from Othram came in the 5th week, Halbrook was sitting in the familiar office, fluorescent ceiling lights reflecting off the old wooden desk. The forensic scientist's voice came through clearly. We have extracted an SNP profile from the hair. The sample belongs to a female, and we have uploaded the information to systems compatible with genealogical tracing through GED match and family tree DNA. Halbrook held his breath. An hour later, preliminary results were sent over. And at that moment, the investigation cracked open a completely new path. Not Jenna's mother's family. Not Jenna's father's family. Not anyone in the Morris lineage. Instead of matching Jenna's relatives as everyone had expected, the DNA sample produced a completely unexpected result. The system showed the hair was genetically related to a 23andMe user named Martha Reyes, living in Medford, Oregon. Oregon, the same state where a hospital had admitted an unidentified girl in 1980, a lead ARC had once uncovered, but was blocked by sealed records laws. When Halbrook read the line "shared DNA, 13.2% match," it felt like a metallic bell ringing in his head. 13.2% meant a relationship neither close nor distant, something like a second cousin or more distant relative sharing a great-grandparent. This raised a massive question. Why was a hair on Jenna's backpack in California in 1975 linked to a person now living in Oregon who had no records before 1980? Halbrook quickly searched public information. Martha Reyes, 62 years old, residing in Medford. No notable activity. No criminal record. No appearance in any criminal tracing system. But what made him freeze was this line in the summary. No recorded documents prior to 1980. A woman over 60, with no birth certificate, no medical records, no school records, no administrative trace before 1980 that was not normal. In such cases, there were only 4 possibilities. 1. The person was adopted outside the system. 2. Identity changed as a child. 3. Victim of an old abduction. 4. Taken into a community or family that never reported. And all 4 possibilities made Halbrook feel one thing. Martha was not just a distant relative of Jenna. Martha's DNA was analyzed further, and the system delivered a second breakthrough. She had a distant but clear relation to the Morris lineage. This meant Martha shared family origins with Jenna, or she was a younger branch separated from the family tree at some point. Halbrook began piecing it together. Jenna disappears in 1975. An unidentified girl admitted to a hospital in Oregon in 1980. Martha Reyes has no records before 1980. Martha's DNA matches the evidence in Jenna's case. The 2 families have a distant link. The question was no longer whose hair it was, but why did the DNA of a woman in Oregon appear on the backpack of a missing girl in California hundreds of miles away before Martha even existed in public records? Halbrook pulled up Merrick's entire file again. He recalled the note KM82, the one no one understood. But now, looking at a map of Oregon, with Medford near the southern border, Halbrook suddenly considered a possibility. KM was not kilometer marker, but kid move code Merrick used for cases of children relocated across state lines, an internal shorthand he had applied in a few cases. And 82 might not be a root code, but the year Merrick believed the child was still alive. If Merrick had seen the Oregon girl lead in 1980, he might have tried linking it to Jenna but lacked authority to unseal the records. KM82 could have been his reminder to revisit it later, but the accident stopped everything forever. With this DNA result, Halbrook formally requested the Oregon court to unseal the 1980 unidentified girl's records. For the first time in over 40 years, there was a specific genetic link justifying access. While awaiting approval, the team dug deeper into Martha Reyes. What shocked them further? Martha had no school records before 1983, meaning if she truly appeared in 1980, she was not enrolled in school for the first 3 years, highly unusual. Oregon's data systems revealed more. The legal guardian listed for Martha in 1980 was a man now deceased, his file brief, no clear employment, and traces of moving across multiple states in the 1970s. Halbrook saw overlapping points scattered like rocks emerging as the tide receded. Nothing was certain, but together with the Polaroid found in storage, the Jenna case was moving into territory untouched for nearly half a century. The possibility Jenna survived after 1975 was taken to Oregon and lived under a different identity. If the sealed records were opened, every suspicion could be verified. And the biggest question, who is Martha Reyes really, awaited its answer. From an unidentified hair strand, a family tree opened, and Jenna Morris's path began to take shape after 50 years submerged in darkness. When the Oregon court issued the order, allowing the investigation team access to the sealed records of the unidentified girl from 1980, Halbrook sat in front of the computer screen, flipping through each newly declassified page, with the tension of someone who had waited nearly half a century for answers. The medical records noted the admission date, April 1980. The girl was approximately 12 to 14 years old, unable to state her name, unable to remember an address, unable to recall where she came from. The hospital noted, no serious injuries. Brought in by a man who said he found her wandering. The man left immediately after handover. Information about the man was completely unverifiable, as he provided no identification, and hospitals at that time had no procedure for photographing individuals bringing in children. But what made Halbrook stand up abruptly was the final line in the file. Child transferred to foster care program, under name Martha Reyes, assigned. This was the first time the name Martha appeared in official documents, no prior records, no notes about parents, no history whatsoever, as if Martha had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. From 1980 onward, a new identity began. While the past was completely blank, the investigation team decided to interview Martha immediately. The meeting took place in Medford, in a small community center conference room. Martha Reyes, now 62 years old, entered with slow but steady steps. She had a kind face, slightly cloudy but alert eyes, and naturally flowing black hair streaked with gray. No one would think this ordinary woman was connected to a nearly 50-year-old disappearance. But as she sat down across from Halbrook, she carried a secret that even she did not fully understand. When asked about her childhood, Martha was silent for a very long time. Halbrook waited, without pressing. Finally, she spoke in a soft, even voice, as if recounting someone else's story, not her own. I don't remember much. I only remember a man. I think he raised me for a while. Not very long. I don't know his name. I don't clearly remember his face. I only remember he always told me, everything's okay now. You don't need to remember anything. Those words sent a chill down Halbrook's spine. In cases of abducted children, perpetrators often used exactly this kind of suggestion, not threats, but creating a vague emptiness in the child's memory about their true origins. He moved to another question. Before 1980, do you remember where you lived? Martha shook her head. No. It's like, I was born at 14. Not a single detail before 1980 existed in Martha's natural memory. The team knew that memories of abducted children are often distorted over time, especially if the adults around them deliberately created a replacement narrative. But something must still remain. When Halbrook asked about physical marks, Martha extended her right hand. At the ankle, there was a faint scar, curved like an arc, no larger than a coin, faded with time. He leaned in to examine it closely, his heart slowing a beat. The scar matched exactly the description Jenna's parents had provided in 1975. Curved scar on the right ankle from a bike fall in 1972. This was not a common type of scar. Size, location, curve, all identical. When asked about the scar, Martha only said, I don't remember how I got it. It's been there since I was little. Halbrook exchanged glances with Clark. Both understood the implication. This was evidence that could not be ignored. If the hair on Jenna's backpack, the 1980 girl records, and the scar matching Jenna's description all aligned, then Martha's lack of childhood memories was no longer just an anomaly. It was a sign of a deliberately hidden past. To strengthen the hypothesis, Halbrook requested the use of age regression technology, a technique simulating facial appearance at different ages based on bone structure, soft tissue, and AI algorithms. Experts reconstructed Jenna's face at age 12, then simulated that face at age 62, and compared it to current photos of Martha Reyes. The screen loaded slowly. Skin texture changed, cheekbones from rounded to sharper, the small childhood nose becoming a straighter bridge, and facial sagging reflecting age. When the simulation completed, the system gave a match percentage, 92%. That number brought an unusual silence to the room. 92% was not coincidence. 92% was a silent confirmation that Martha Reyes's identity might only be a shadow replacement for someone else. When Halbrook placed the simulated image next to a real photo of Martha and asked, "Have you ever seen this face before?" Martha's eyes widened, and she leaned back slightly. I don't know. But looking at this picture, It feels familiar, like it's me from a very long time ago, but I don't remember anything. That answer did not clarify the truth, but it made everything clearer in another way. If Martha's memories were distorted, age regression could touch the emotional memory layer that rational memory no longer held. After the first interview, Halbrook knew the next step had to be direct DNA confirmation. He explained to Martha the reason for the investigation, about a girl named Jenna Morris, who disappeared in 1975, and that Martha's DNA appeared in the case evidence. Martha was not surprised, which surprised him more than her calm. Martha only asked, "If I am that girl, does that mean I once belonged to a different family?" Her voice held no panic, but the relief of someone who had lived their whole life in emptiness and now found an opening. Martha agreed to provide a DNA sample. As she extended her arm for the technician to draw blood, Halbrook noticed another detail. On Martha's left wrist was a very small scar, only half a centimeter long, exactly the spot where Jenna's father had once said his daughter had a scratch from a broken glass when she was 8 years old. 2 scars, not one. As the DNA sample was sent off, Halbrook stood in the community center hallway, leaning against the wall, breathing deeply. He remembered the helplessness of the first 20 years investigating, remembered the forgotten Polaroid envelope for 48 years, and now the DNA of a woman who did not remember herself could be the key to unlocking the entire truth. If Martha truly was Jenna, then the biggest question was no longer where did the girl go, but who took her, and why let her live under a different identity for nearly half a century. As Halbrook looked toward the testing room, he knew the DNA results were not just identity confirmation, but the door opening into the deepest part of the case. The lost 18 early years of Martha Reyes's life, and what had happened before that name appeared in the 1980 records. Every answer now lay in the freshly sealed and shipped DNA sample. All that remained was time, and the final truth could hide no longer. The DNA results for Martha Reyes came back at the end of the second week. In the small conference room at the Sacramento Police Department, the white light from the bulbs reflected off the sealed envelope that Halbrook placed on the table as if it were something sacred. When he opened the envelope, his heart beat slow and heavy. Though he had anticipated it, he still found it hard to believe that after nearly 50 years, the truth could be uncovered by a microgram DNA sample too small for the naked eye to see. The results page had only a few key lines, but enough to change the entire landscape of the case. Probabilistic kinship match, 99.999%. Relationship confirmation. Direct biological identity, consistent with missing child, Jenna Morris. There was no doubt left. Martha Reyes equals Jenna Morris. The 12-year-old girl who vanished in 1975 had indeed survived, been separated from her family, and reappeared as an 18-year-old woman in 1980 in Oregon, under the name assigned by authorities, Martha Reyes. Halbrook sat down in the chair, hands resting on the table, silent for several seconds. Throughout his career, he had seen dozens of cases close forever, but never one where a child missing for 50 years was found alive in the body of an adult. The entire investigation team stood around the table at that moment, silent, as if witnessing something beyond the scope of their work. This was not just identity verification, it was confirmation of a stolen existence. But the most important question remained unanswered. Who took Jenna? Who created the identity Martha Reyes? And then, as the team expanded Martha's records, they found the first detail leading them to a name no one expected. In the temporary foster care file from 1980 in Oregon, the initial guardian information section was very brief. Insurance provider. Harold K. No full last name, no address, no occupation. But in an attached file, there was a photocopy of a minor's health insurance form. With a scrawled but clear signature, Harold Kane. Halbrook felt as if someone had gripped his chest tightly. This was no longer coincidence, no longer speculation. For the first time, the name Harold Kane appeared officially in documents directly related to Martha Reyes. The person DNA confirmed was Jenna Morris. Halbrook immediately opened the California resident lookup system for the 1970s. In the old address list, there was a name, Harold James Kane, residing in Sacramento, 1973 to 1975. The line made everything click together piece by piece. Kane lived in Sacramento at the exact time Jenna disappeared. Not only that, Halbrook continued checking the data. Kane's address was less than 1.6 miles from the library where Jenna left, close to Jenna's usual route home, close to Maplewood Drive. And more importantly, Kane left California on June 17, 1975, just 3 days after Jenna vanished. Not a mistake, not coincidence. A man living near the disappearance scene, leaving the state right after the incident, and 5 years later appearing in Oregon as the guardian, at least on paper, of an unidentified girl. Halbrook felt as if someone had turned on a light in a dark room inside his mind. The scattered pieces over nearly 50 years, the strange woman at the library, the black hair strand, the alley, the ARC maps, the unidentified girl in 1980 all began converging around the name Kane. When the team pulled Kane's personal records, a picture grew clearer. Harold Kane, born in 1935 in Idaho, freelance laborer, moving through multiple states. No serious criminal record, but once accused of inappropriate approach to children in Reno in 1969. 1969 investigation inconclusive. File closed. Kane's Social Security number activated in 1979 in Oregon, and in the same system, a minor's Social Security number matching Martha Reyes was registered under Kane's identifier. This meant, at least for a short time, Kane had acted as guardian or financial supporter for Martha, that is, Jenna. The first question Halbrook asked: if Kane took Jenna in 1975, why in 1985 years later did he turn the girl over to a hospital in Oregon? No one had an answer yet. The team continued tracing Kane's path backward. Tax records showed he worked odd jobs at small farms in Northern California, then moved to Oregon in 1977. No clues explaining who Kane lived with during that time. But one small detail chilled Halbrook. In Kane's 1979 insurance enrollment, the dependent members field was blank. No child listed. No companion. No family information. That suggested Kane did not want authorities to know he was caring for a child, or was not allowed to report it. When the team searched old driver's licenses in Oregon's archives, they found Kane's photo ID from 1981. Gaunt face, deep-set eyes, straight nose bridge. Halbrook immediately compared this photo to the man's silhouette reflected in the Polaroid, the picture of the girl in the car. Though the reflection was blurry and distorted by the glass curve, the cheekbone position, forehead shape, and angle made the whole team look at each other in silence. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. It appeared to be the same person. Kane was in Sacramento the day Jenna disappeared. Kane vanished from California 3 days later. Kane appeared in Oregon during the time the girl, now Martha Reyes, was admitted without papers. Kane registered insurance for Martha. Kane had been investigated in a child disappearance in 1969. Kane's timeline and Jenna's began overlapping like two parallel rails merging into one. Halbrook wrote one final line in his notebook. Harold Kane, primary suspect. Martha Reyes confirmed equals Jenna Morris. But what kept him awake that night was a more horrifying question. If Kane was the one who took Jenna, what happened in the 5 years from 1975 to 1980 before the girl was taken to the hospital? The case had found the victim's identity after nearly 50 years. But the identity of the person who took her and the reason had only just begun to emerge from the shadows. When Martha Reyes's identity was confirmed as Jenna Morris, the first thing Halbrook did was immediately request the investigation team to expand the search for every location ever associated with Harold Kane between 1975 and 1980. Tax data, rental addresses, seasonal labor records, even cattle ranch paperwork were all traced back. Among them, one address made everyone stop. An old wooden house on the outskirts of Ashland, Oregon, where Kane had lived briefly in 1978 to 1979, before disappearing from paperwork for about a year. The house had been abandoned since the early 1980s, now decayed, wooden pillars leaning, roof with several holes, and moss covering the steps like the skin of an aging creature. But the important thing was, no one had searched this house before, because it was not until 2023 that Kane was known to be connected to the Jenna case. A team of current investigators, along with Halbrook and Clark, entered the house on a foggy Oregon morning. The air was damp and cold, carrying the smell of rotting wood and timeless dust. The front door was locked with old wire, as if Kane had locked it from inside and never returned. When the team broke the seal and stepped in, flashlight beams shone on thick cobwebs and scratches on the walls, scratches from time or from something else. The ground floor was almost empty. Just a wooden table with a broken leg, a few rusted tin cans, and piles of old newspapers scattered on the floor, most torn to shreds. But when Clark opened the door to the small room at the end of the hallway, the whole team immediately realized this was the place Kane had actually used. On the floor, covered in dust, was a wooden box containing children's items. A few plastic toys from the 1970s style, a doll missing its left eye, a deflated yellow rubber ball, and especially a light blue backpack, small enough for a 12 to 13-year-old child. Though time had faded the fabric, the backpack's design was exactly the popular style in California during the 1970s. Halbrook crouched down, put on gloves, and lifted the backpack. The zipper was rusted, but inside remained a scrap of handwritten paper. Just the words, "Belongs to Jay." No last name, no date. Just one letter, but enough to make Halbrook's throat go dry. There was no reason for Harold Kane to keep a child's backpack, unless it belonged to the child he had taken. Next to the wooden box was a misaligned floorboard. When Clark shone his flashlight down, the light reflected off a metallic surface. They lifted the plank and discovered a small tin box, sealed with a latch and wrapped in cloth. Inside the box was a thin, leather-bound notebook, cracked cover, apparently once carefully hidden. The notebook was what made the entire room hold its breath. Inside, Kane's handwriting filled pages with symbols. Dates scribbled hastily, short descriptions of stops, forest roads, no one must see, move before sunset. But what gave Halbrook goosebumps was the symbol repeated on many pages, KM82. Exactly like Detective Merrick's note in 1976, same symbol, same handwriting style, same hyphen, same position on the page, offset to the right margin. Page 7 of the notebook even spelled it out more clearly. KM82 Final Move Plan. End relocation before 8/82. Do not return to California. At the very bottom line, Kane wrote, Kid Move 1982. Each word stretched out like a deep sinking mark from a man preparing for a major plan. The explanation was crystal clear. Not detective code, not cryptic symbol. KM82 stood for Kid Move. 1982, Kane's plan for the child. A relocation plan. A plan to leave Oregon. A plan to take Jenna with her new identity as Martha to a completely different place in 1982. And if it was the final plan, that meant before 1982, Kane had moved Jenna multiple times between locations. Halbrook sat on the floor, the notebook open in front of him. He flipped back to the early pages. Some listed small towns in Northern California, then crossed out. Some noted not safe, a few too close to patrols, secluded parking spot, Prairie City, Redding, Grants Pass. Places Kane had passed through according to labor data. Everything matched. On a page near the middle of the notebook, Kane wrote, Girl still quiet. Doesn't talk about before 75. No further analysis needed. Halbrook understood the meaning. Kane selected a child who wouldn't talk about the past, or deliberately made sure the child couldn't remember. Another page noted, When old enough, change papers. Jenna, when admitted to the Oregon hospital in 1980, had been assigned a new name because she had no papers. But that detail matched Kane's notebook plan in a terrifying way. He had planned to change the girl's identity. Clark opened the tin box further and found a few loose scraps of paper. One listed numbers like route directions, or 99-238 Pine Ridge. Another was a shopping list, including child sandals, old textbooks, hair ties. Nothing in the house proved Jenna stayed there long, but everything showed Kane had brought her here, at least during one phase before 1980. When forensics arrived, they seized the wooden box, backpack, toys, notebook, and every small scrap of paper. One specialist said quietly to Halbrook, If these items still hold biological traces, we can unearth Jenna's entire hidden past in Kane's hands. Halbrook nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the repeated KM82 symbol in the notebook, like an obsession of a man always thinking about the day he would have to move the child again, until fully escaping California and Oregon. But what chilled him most was one final line, written near the end of the notebook. If anyone comes looking, leave immediately. Leave nothing behind. Kane truly left nothing except a 62-year-old woman with empty memories and a stolen life. And his notebook, hidden under the floor where time accidentally preserved the secret he didn't have time to erase. The notebook shifted the case from, "Where did Jenna go?" to a much larger question. During the 5 full years from 1975 to 1980, what kind of life did Jenna live in Harold Kane's hands? The discovery of Harold Kane's notebook and abandoned house was only the beginning. To understand his entire 50-year journey shrouded in darkness, the investigation team had to reconstruct Kane's movement path from 1973 until he vanished completely in the early 1990s. This work was like following the tracks of a wild animal that had wandered half its life, leaving few traces, and the remaining ones fragmented, broken, filled with terrifying gaps. Thanks to the development of digital archiving systems, the team could trace back utility bills, traffic records, registered license plates, and even old rental contracts scanned into Oregon and California data repositories. These tiny bits of information were gradually pieced together into a bizarre map. Kane rarely stayed in one place longer than 10 to 14 months. This was a typical sign of those evading authorities, people who always moved before anyone could ask questions. From 1973 to 1975, Kane's address was recorded in Sacramento. It was during this period that Kane likely stalked or became aware of Jenna. When Jenna disappeared, Kane left California within 72 hours. This matched his habit of quick relocation, always vanishing as soon as the surrounding environment showed signs of instability. From 1976 to 1979, Kane appeared sporadically in small towns of Northern California and Southern Oregon. Tax records showed he did temporary work at farms, lumber mills, or resorts. Common feature: areas with thin police presence, rarely updating cross-state data. Investigator Carter commented, he knew exactly where to be to avoid detection. Halbrook quietly underlined key dates in Kane's notebook. Each date matched an address change. He was always one step ahead. Not long after, the team discovered something even more suspicious. Throughout his 50 years of movement, Kane tended to choose small towns where child disappearances had occurred. Carter presented the findings while everyone was gathered in the investigation room. 1969, Reno, Nevada. A 7-year-old boy disappeared. Kane lived near the area. 1975, Sacramento. Jenna disappeared. 1977, Redding, California. 2 girls aged 9 and 11 reported missing within 3 months. Never found. Kane was in Redding during that time. 1979, Grants Pass, Oregon. A 13-year-old girl vanished after evening classes. Kane worked at a farm only 11 miles from where the girl disappeared. Halbrook set his pen down on the table. No longer coincidence. No longer isolated suspicion. This was a movement pattern, and the pattern fit exactly the behavior of mobile predators. Moving from town to town, selecting victims in areas with weak authority, then disappearing before anyone could trace them. The map spread out before them like a twisted path nearly 2,000 miles long, from Nevada to California to Oregon. Each red dot on the map was a disappearance, and each dot lay within Kane's range of activity based on fuel receipts, work hours, or license plates from old records. There were periods when Kane vanished completely from records. 1981 to 1982, no official documents recorded him. But the notebook line, Final Move Plan 882, showed he had an important plan during this phase. If what he wrote was true, then Jenna likely experienced a major event in 1982, something Martha's memory no longer retained. An older file, almost forgotten in Jackson County's storage, provided another crucial piece. In 1980, a traffic camera in Oregon captured a 1968 Ford pickup truck, with a plate matching Kane's registration records, appearing near Medford Hospital on the day the unidentified girl was admitted. The photo was blurry, but the plate was readable. He appeared, dropped off Jenna, then vanished right after. Halbrook concluded. Kane not only took Jenna, but controlled her life for at least 5 years. What chilled the team more was Carter's discovery. Kane's movement path not only overlapped with Jenna's case but matched 4 other disappearances over 20 years, all girls aged 7 to 14. None of the cases were solved, no one arrested, no one found. In the summary chart, Carter marked the disappearances in red and Kane's path in blue. When the 2 lines were overlaid, the overlap was so extensive it could not be considered random. Halbrook looked at the map and said softly, Kane didn't just abduct Jenna. He may be a mobile child predator we never identified. For decades, Kane avoided areas with strong police forces, never lived near major cities, always chose places with minimal tracking systems and easy blending into manual labor communities. He used fake names in some years, real names in others, and frequently changed jobs. One specialist in the group commented, Kane wasn't smarter than the system, he just appeared. At the exact time the system wasn't strong enough to see him. All this data showed Kane always knew exactly what he was doing. He avoided all social interaction. No friends. No family. No emotional traces. Only movement, change, evasion, and possibly searching for new victims. Halbrook wrapped up the path analysis with a sentence that silenced the room. We are no longer investigating a single disappearance. We are looking at the 50-year journey of a predator, and Jenna is the only one who survived. And as every lead pointed to Kane, the biggest question remained unanswered. Why did he take Jenna to the hospital in 1980? What happened on the last day Kane was with her? When the investigation team began collecting all medical records for Martha Reyes from 1980 onward, they quickly discovered a strange gap. There were no medical records for Martha at all before April 1980. No doctor's visits, no vaccinations, no x-rays, no evidence she had ever appeared at any medical facility, completely abnormal for a child around 12 to 14 years old. Oregon law in 1980 required minors to have at least minimal vaccination records to attend school or enter healthcare programs. But Martha, that is, Jenna, began existing as a blank slate. No past, no data, no traces. Investigator Carter questioned doctors who had worked in Medford that year. One, now retired, Dr. Elliot Hargarty, remembered the unidentified girl case from 1980 very clearly. In a video interview, he spoke slowly, voice hoarse with age but still sharp. That girl didn't seem like she was cared for by the man who brought her in. I can't explain it, but something was wrong. Not medically wrong. Wrong about the way she looked at him. Hargarty remembered the child was quiet, always looking down, avoiding eye contact with strangers, but especially fearful whenever a man's shadow passed the hospital room door. He believed one thing. She wasn't the biological daughter of the man who handed her over to the hospital. Halbrook leaned back in his chair, feeling like he was hearing the voice of what he had always suspected but no one had ever dared say. Kane wasn't just the one who took Jenna, he was the one who created an environment that made her unable to remember her early life. Dr. Hargarty continued with an important detail. A few months later, in 1981, when Martha was brought in for a routine checkup by the second guardian in the foster program, not Kane, another doctor, Dr. Linda Rowe, had written a short but cutting note. Child's age inconsistent with reported timeline. Skeletal markers show earlier development. In professional terms, that meant Martha appeared 13 to 14 on paper, but bone structure showed she was slightly older, matching Jenna, who would have been 17 at that time if her papers hadn't been altered. Hargarty said Rowe had reported to program management that the child may not be who the papers say she is. Right after that note, a strangely coincidental event occurred. Kane transferred care. Based on archived records, after that visit, Martha was no longer allowed to return to the old facility. Child Services described the initial guardian as no longer involved, and Martha was moved to another foster home. But digging deeper, Halbrook discovered Kane had requested all medical records be transferred to another facility before suddenly leaving Oregon at the end of 1981. No one knew why. No one knew where he went. No one knew what he had done with Jenna. before being forced to take her to the hospital in 1980. No one knew why he returned in 1981, then suddenly vanished again. Only one thing was clear. Kane left as soon as he sensed the risk of exposure. When the team analyzed the stored X-ray films from the hospital shots of Martha's wrist, legs, and spine upon admission, Halbrook requested they be compared to Jenna's X-rays taken in 1972 after her bike fall. Fortunately, Jenna's family had kept the old films, and they were in the original case file. When the two sets of films were placed side by side under the X-ray viewbox light, the room nearly held its breath. On Jenna's old film, there was a healed microfracture in the left wrist bone treated by the family doctor. It was a highly distinctive injury type, almost like a skeletal fingerprint, and when zooming in on Martha's 1980 X-ray film, that fracture was still there. Exact position, exact shape. Halbrook whispered softly. No mistake possible. From then on, every doubt became fact. Martha Reyes was Jenna Morris, not just through DNA, but through bone structure evidence that doesn't lie. The investigation continued, and forensics began deeper study of the medical records to determine if Jenna had suffered any other injuries while with Kane. One rib area X-ray showed an old fracture, likely occurring 1 or 2 years before admission. Not too severe, but enough to prove the girl had experienced trauma without proper treatment. Investigator Carter said in a low voice, "If this injury happened while she was with Kane, then what Jenna went through during that time was more serious than we thought." Halbrook was silent, hands clasped together. He didn't want to delve into speculation, but all clues led to a chilling conclusion. Kane didn't just take Jenna, he controlled her life like property, and any doctor's suspicion made him frantically flee. Finally, when compiling all medical documents from 1980 to 1982, one conclusion was undeniable. Jenna appeared in Oregon with no past records. She had old injuries matching Jenna's medical history in California. She showed signs of having lived with a man who was not her parent, and a doctor in 1981 had noted age-bone discrepancy. Everything fit the pattern of an abducted child. Identity changed and moved across states. Halbrook closed the file folder, eyes gazing into the distance. Kane had left behind a child with empty memories, old injuries, and a name that wasn't hers. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Why did he have to take Jenna to the hospital in 1980? What happened before that to make Kane abandon the child he had kept for 5 years? When the DNA records, Kane's notebook, and his 50-year movement history were fully compiled, the investigation team decided to transfer all data to the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit (BAU) at Quantico. This was no longer a single abduction case, but the pattern of a mobile predator operating for decades without ever being identified. In the first meeting, BAU expert Dr. Carla Morrison reviewed Kane's entire journey, how he moved, chose locations, timed actions, selected victims. She opened her laptop and projected the diagram on the screen. Red dots marked child disappearances overlapping Kane's path. Green dots were addresses where he had lived. When the two data layers were overlaid, the entire meeting room fell into silence. Morrison began. This man is not impulsive, not spontaneous. This is the type of offender we call family replacement fixation, obsessed with replacing a family. That phrase thickened the air. The BAU pointed out 3 characteristics of this offender group. 1. They do not abduct children to harm them immediately. 2. They keep children as a substitute family member. 3. When the environment shows risk of detection, they immediately relocate the victim to a new place, change roles, change the story, change identity. Halbrook listened, feeling like every piece was finally clicking together. According to Morrison, Kane's behavior fit perfectly. Constant movement, but not too far. Always choosing areas with thin police presence. Keeping children's items in the house, toys, backpack. Secret notes about destinations, departure points, change papers. Tight monitoring of the child, but keeping the child long enough to create an image of caretaker. This explained why Jenna, in her hazy memories, always said she was raised by a man but couldn't remember his name. For a child whose memories were erased through fear and isolation, that caretaker often became the sole center of their world. Morrison continued. In cases we've studied, this group does not kill children unless cornered. They do everything to maintain the binding relationship, however distorted, between them and the victim. Investigator Carter asked, so why did Kane take Jenna to the hospital in 1980? If he wanted to keep her, why let go? Morrison paused for a moment, then answered, because he feared getting caught. And when someone with family replacement fixation senses loss of control, they flee to protect themselves, even if it means abandoning the child. This explanation matched perfectly the suspicion from Dr. Rowe in 1981, forcing Kane to flee Oregon. But after analyzing current behavior, the BAU moved to something that chilled Halbrook more Kane's past. They reopened the Nevada file from 1969, where a 7-year-old boy disappeared in Reno. In the old file, a name had been mentioned, then crossed out for lack of evidence. Suspect, Harold James Kane, questioned, released. The file clearly stated, Kane lived only 0.8 miles from where the boy disappeared. A witness saw a thin man with short hair leading the boy toward an old parking lot. Police questioned Kane, but due to lack of physical evidence and no prior record at the time, the case stalled. 1 week later, Kane left Nevada. In the old file, the 1969 investigator's note read, this man is too calm, doesn't seem innocent. But no evidence. The boy was never found, and the case faded into oblivion. Dr. Morrison placed both files, the 1969 boy and 1975 Jenna, on the table, then said, these two cases are similar not just in disappearance, but in behavioral pattern. He chooses moments when the victim's family is distracted. He moves the victim the same day. He leaves the state within 48 to 72 hours. Kane's method was calculated, cold, and cyclical. The BAU also analyzed Kane's handwriting in the notebook. Heavy pressure, right slant, high-speed signs of someone living in constant vigilance, always prepared to flee. Each note was short, but contained strategic information. Secluded forest spots, sunset times, off-map trails, ways to avoid traffic patrols. Someone like that does not abduct once by chance. This was habit, a repeating pattern, a way of life. Carter asked the question everyone was thinking. Could Kane have other victims besides Jenna? Dr. Morrison nodded. We believe at least 4 child disappearances, from 1969 to 1982, show complete overlap with Kane's path. And we haven't accounted for the period he vanished from records after 1983. This opened a horrifying possibility. Kane could be one of the longest operating child abductors on the West Coast, never detected. Because he did not kill victims immediately, no bodies were left, making cases hard to link. And because he moved constantly, states did not coordinate investigations, data scattered, leading to 50 years of Kane evading law enforcement radar. Morrison concluded, people like Kane don't stop because they're bored. They stop because something forces them to. We need to know what made him vanish from records after 1983. One final sentence Halbrook never forgot. People like Kane don't just take children. They build a private world where they have absolute power. And Jenna, or Martha, is the only one who ever escaped that world. When the meeting ended, Halbrook looked at the note wall. From 1969 to 1982, Kane's timeline stretched like a crack running across America. Only one child survived, Jenna Morris. And a bigger question still loomed ahead. Where did Kane go after 1983, and what really ended his decades-long crime cycle? Entering the forensic synthesis phase, the Jenna Morris case was no longer a series of scattered clues, but became a complete forensic structure, where DNA, physical traces, movement maps, behavioral analysis, and the Polaroid image all had to be fitted into the same timeline. The investigation team understood that, to identify Harold Kane as the perpetrator, they had to reconstruct his entire path over 50 years and connect every smallest trace to Jenna's appearance and disappearance. The process began with the black hair strand found on Jenna's backpack in 1975. After Othram decoded the SNPs, the hair yielded DNA results matching Martha Reyes at 13.2% distant relatives. Completely abnormal, since Martha had no connection to the Jenna family in records. When the team took a direct DNA sample from Martha and compared it to the Morris family, the figure 99.999% appeared as the final confirmation. Martha was Jenna. This was the first pillar of the forensic timeline, the surviving victim, separated from her family, existing under a new identity. Next, Martha's X-rays from 1980 were placed on the view box. When shining light directly on the left wrist fracture, forensics realized it matched perfectly the injury Jenna suffered in 1972 after her bike fall. The ankle scar also fit the family's description of Jenna. A mishealed rib proved Jenna had been injured while living with Cain and not treated properly. X-rays became the second layer of evidence no one could deny. At this point, only the man who had controlled the girl's life for the 5 missing years was lacking. That was when Harold Cain's notebook found under the rotten floorboard in the abandoned Ashland house took center stage. The knife-like entries, forest spot, no one must see, change papers, and especially the haunting repeated symbol, KM82, decoded as Kid Move 1982, showed Cain had planned Jenna's final relocation in 1982. Notes like, "Girl still quiet, doesn't talk about before 75" proved he knew Jenna had original memories, while showing he had tried to control, distort, or erase them. This was the third forensic layer: behavior and intent recorded in the perpetrator's own handwriting. But to charge Cain, the team needed proof he and Jenna appeared together at critical times, especially 1975. That was when the Polaroid in the evidence unprocessed envelope became the game-changing piece. When the photo was scanned at high resolution, investigators discovered a man's silhouette reflected on the car window, cheek angle, jawline, and forehead matching Cain's 1981 driver's license photo. The girl in the photo, brown hair, small shoulders, eyes looking out in fear, fit Jenna's description at disappearance. But the most crucial evidence was in the Polaroid's corner window. After separating the reflection layer, enhancing contrast, and adjusting curved light, 3 faint digits appeared. 6, 8, 1. According to 1970s California plate structure, these 3 numbers were in the upper part of the license plate. When the team cross-referenced DMV data from 1974 to 1975, they found the full plate, 6TQ681, registered to a Ford Econoline owned by Harold James Cain, residing in Sacramento, at the exact time Jenna vanished. This was the moment every forensic layer intersected into one. DNA confirming Martha equals Jenna. X-rays matching perfectly. Notebook showing Cain planned child relocation. Cain's movement path overlapping disappearances and fitting Jenna's Oregon appearance. And now, the Polaroid proving Cain stood right outside the vehicle containing Jenna. All combined into a complete forensic mosaic. Halbrook placed each piece of evidence on the large meeting room screen. Hair strand DNA, X-rays body memory, notebook intent, Polaroid scene, plate vehicle, movement history timeline, and reflected face perpetrator. Each element alone was just a trace, but fitted into the same timeline, they formed undeniable proof. Cain was in Sacramento in 1975. Cain vanished 3 days after Jenna disappeared. Cain took Jenna to Oregon in 1980. Cain changed identity and registered health insurance for Jenna in 1980 under his name. Cain had the same plate appearing in the Polaroid, and Cain owned the notebook describing exact child relocation operations during Jenna's missing period. No room for doubt left. Harold James Cain was the one who abducted Jenna Morris in 1975 and kept her for 5 years before being forced to take her to the hospital. The entire room fell silent as Halbrook read the conclusion. Nearly 50 years had passed, and the truth finally had a face. Not mystery, not speculation, but a sharp, irreversible forensic conclusion. But the case was not closed yet, because one question everyone wanted answered remained. Where did Cain go after 1983, and was he still alive to face the truth he had hidden for nearly half a century? Identifying the perpetrator was only part of the journey. The next step was the legal process to restore the victim's true identity, after nearly half a century living in the shadow of a name that was not hers. When the complete forensic evidence package was transferred to the California Department of Justice, including the 99.999% DNA report, matching X-ray films, the Polaroid reflecting Cain's vehicle plate, the KM82 notebook, and the FBI BAU behavioral report, the court immediately initiated a special hearing to consider the request to confirm Martha Reyes was Jenna Morris, the 12-year-old child who disappeared in 1975. Since Jenna was still alive and had completely lost childhood memories, the representing attorney needed to prove her legal identity through scientific evidence rather than personal recollection. In the hearing, the judge read each item in the file. DNA undisputable. X-rays matching Jenna's distinctive 1972 injury. Oregon hospital records noting an unidentified girl appearing in 1980, and especially Kane's insurance documents, proving he had listed Martha as a dependent with no legal or biological relation. The courtroom fell silent as the enlarged Polaroid images appeared on the screen, showing Kane's reflection outside the car door, plate 681 emerging like the final mark tying him to the case. The judge struck the gavel and declared, "Martha Reyes is Jenna Morris. Under California state law, her legal identity will be restored." After 49 years, a stolen name was returned to its owner. But restoring identity was not just changing a name. It involved recovering medical records, canceling Martha's old Social Security number, and issuing a new one under Jenna Morris, updating tax systems, insurance systems, and identification systems. Each step had to rely on the court conclusion and confirming forensic documents. The California Department of Justice also had to send official notification to Oregon to void all legal data related to the name Martha Reyes, an identity created through deception and control by Harold Kane. While the investigation team was handling the final procedures, another piece of information unexpectedly surfaced and immediately turned the entire case in a new direction. Investigator Carter, while reviewing Harold Kane's historical financial records, discovered a very small but completely illogical detail: a post office box Kane rented in Grants Pass in 1979. One he had stopped using in the early 1980s, was still being paid for regularly, all the way to 2024. Even the rental fees were paid almost perfectly on time, with no late months. This could not come from Kane, since he vanished from society in the mid-1980s with no financial traces afterward. If Kane was dead or deliberately in hiding, then who had been paying this fee for over 40 years? Halbrook requested transaction records review. The payments came from a small bank in Idaho, transferred through an account not in a real person's name but under a shell company established in 1983, the same time Kane vanished from records. Company name: North Bend Timber Holdings. The company had no commercial activity, no employees, no tax filings beyond the minimum to maintain legal status. It existed only to transfer a few dozen dollars each year to keep the post office box active. This made everyone in the meeting room pause at once. If the box had been maintained for nearly half a century, it must contain something or serve communication for someone still alive, someone connected to Kane, or sharing his criminal secret, Carter said slowly. If Kane opened this box to receive mail, maintaining it means someone wants to keep it always ready, as if waiting for something to return. There was even a possibility the box served not just Kane but a second person who may have assisted him in moving Jenna from California to Oregon, or who knew what he had done with her. Internal messages were sent across states. Search for information on any individual ever linked to Kane in work, rentals, seasonal jobs, or vehicle registrations. A strange file from 1980 surfaced. A man named Thomas Quayle, who worked at the same lumber mill in Ashland as Kane, fired around the time Kane left Oregon. Quayle vanished from records in 1984, exactly when the shell company North Bend Timber was formed. No one knew where he went. No one knew if he was alive or dead. But one thing was certain. Someone who knew Kane well, knew about the Jenna case, and continued paying to keep a door to the past open, ready for something no one yet knew. The legal conclusion announced on June 12, 2024, restoring Jenna Morris's identity after nearly half a century, seemed to close the case. But Kane's post office box still existing, still maintained, still a gateway to another secret, made Halbrook write one final sentence in the report. We have identified the victim, identified the perpetrator, but the investigation is not over yet. When the court records establishing Jenna Morris's identity were released, The California investigative community immediately entered a state of silent alert. From what seemed like a single disappearance, what the investigation team had gathered: DNA genealogy, Harold Cain's travel map, the KM82 notebook, the Polaroid reflecting the license plate, the vague Oregon medical records, had uncovered an entire data network that no one had previously seen in full. And the first consequence was 12 child cold cases from the period 1968 to 1987 were reactivated and reopened simultaneously. Names that had lain dormant in storage for decades were being pulled out file by file, placed alongside Cain's interstate travel path routes stretching from Sacramento, Eugene, Grants Pass, to Idaho and Nevada. Just the overlap in locations in these 12 files with Cain's claimed movements was enough for the California Department of Justice to issue a document requesting a full review of all federal missing children data from the era before the modern NCIC system existed. Investigators realized, without Othram's genealogical analysis, without the distant relative SNP profile match, without the 2023 evidence storage digitization, the Jenna case could have remained in darkness forever, like thousands of others from the 1970s and 1980s. And precisely because of this, the California Department of Justice proposed a groundbreaking change. FGG, forensic genetic genealogy, must be applied statewide, not just for homicides or suspected murders as before, but for all missing persons cases under 18 from the pre-digital decades. This had never happened before. FGG had been restricted by cost, legality, and sensitivity. But the Jenna case proved clearly that abductions without bloody scenes could still be solved through DNA genealogy if microscopic evidence still existed somewhere in storage. The summary report from the Sacramento Investigation Office stated clearly, without the SNP from the hair on the backpack strap, Jenna Morris would remain a permanently missing file. When this report was elevated to the federal level, numerous other investigative agencies began seriously considering budget reallocation. And within California, a deeper review began. Missing child procedures from the 1970s to 1990s had missed too many links. These errors needed standardization if future second Harold Cains were to be prevented. The Interagency Committee on Missing Children immediately drafted a list of 6 reform points. 1. Mandatory timeline establishment within the first 90 minutes, and verification of the child's logical movement route, instead of assuming runaway. 2. Review of old traffic cameras and infrared photos from 1970s optical cameras stored in city archives. 3. Implementation of standard evidence retrieval procedures. Instead of letting evidence sit damp and moldy in storage like Jenna's Polaroid, his 4 requirement to compare suspicious adult travel histories within a 10-mile radius. 5. Mandatory storage of hair fabric cloth items from victims in climate-controlled cabinets. 6. Mandatory use of FGG if a child has been missing over 10 years and biological relatives have died or cannot provide DNA. Each of these 6 points stemmed from the Jenna case. Cain could have been caught in 1980 if the Oregon hospital had not discarded records. In 1975 if Sacramento police had not overlooked the valueless Polaroid. In 1976 if that year's detective had not been reassigned right after the KM82 note. Professional meetings from Los Angeles to Fresno began reconstructing the Jenna case map as a mandatory case study for training young investigators, especially emphasizing not to treat teen missing cases as runaways. The investigative community also faced a larger consequence. Cain could not have maintained the post office box for 40 years alone. This led law enforcement to consider the possibility of a second subject, a passive accomplice or partner aware of Cain's actions. If a second person maintained the box from 1983 to 2024, that meant at least one individual could be linked to child abductions over 50 years. This forced the State Task Force Committee to draft a proposal to the DOJ. All child cold cases must be reanalyzed under the multi-offender possibility model. No longer could anyone assume lone perpetrator as in 1970s thinking. Media pressure intensified. The American public asked, how many children like Jenna were taken that we don't know about? And California's investigative community, facing a case solved after 50 years, understood that Jenna had not only changed her own fate, she had changed how the entire state confronted disappearances that seemed unsolvable. But one question still hung in the air. If Kane had died long ago, then who was the person behind the post office box paid for, all the way to 2024? And in the investigative community, that was no longer just a question for the Jenna case, it was a warning for the future. When all the forensic reports, DNA genealogy data, behavioral analysis from the FBI, BAU, and final physical evidence from the Polaroid were fully assembled into a single timeline, the California Investigation Office officially released a summary report, over 300 pages thick. This was the first time in state history that a disappearance spanning exactly half a century was resolved, with complete modern scientific evidence alongside traditional data revived from the past. The opening conclusion of the report carried a sharp, cold tone. Based on incontrovertible evidence, Jenna Morris survived her 1975 disappearance and lived under the name Martha Reyes from 1980 onward. The offender responsible for her abduction is identified as Harold James Kane. Case closed after 50 years. The entire investigative structure was recreated as a single thread running through time. Jenna leaving the Sacramento Library in 1975, taken by Kane the same day, living with him for about 5 years, appearing without papers at an Oregon hospital in 1980, growing up under the name Martha Reyes, and finally having her identity confirmed through forensic genealogy in 2023. The layers of evidence formed an unmistakable picture. SNP DNA matching the Morris family, bone marks and X-rays perfectly matching Jenna's childhood injuries. Plate 6, TQ68, one reflected on the Polaroid glass, Kane's notebook noting KM, 82, and Kane's movement history overlapping every phase of Jenna's disappearance. Independent appraisers and 3 forensic labs confirmed this entire evidence chain met the indisputable standard, irrefutable, under modern forensic science. The report also stated clearly, no evidence Jenna was held by multiple perpetrators. All signs pointed to Kane alone. The notebook entries, work history, license plate, controlling behavior, insurance records, and evidence from the abandoned house all described a lone offender pattern without sharing the child or coordinating with others. Though Kane's post office box paid through 2024 remained puzzling, no evidence proved a direct accomplice in Jenna's case. Therefore, the final legal conclusion, Harold James Kane was the sole perpetrator and fully responsible for the 1975 abduction of Jenna Morris. At the end of the report, the special committee wrote a historically significant remark. Jenna Morris is the longest-known surviving missing child case resolved in the state of California. Her recovery, though delayed for 5 decades, demonstrates the absolute necessity of forensic re-examination, cross-state coordination, and genetic genealogy. On the same day the report was released, the court officially noted the update. Legal identity confirmed. Martha Reyes no longer exists in administrative records. Legal name: Jenna Lynn Morris. In the small meeting room at the Sacramento Police Department, Hal Brook, the man who had pursued this case for half his life, closed the file folder. On the cover, the final red stamp was applied. Case closed. He read the last line in the report, as if wanting to etch it into his memory. Case closed, after 50 years. Evidence indisputable. After nearly half a century, the name Jenna Morris was no longer a faded shadow on a missing child poster, no longer an unanswered question, no longer an echo in a cold storage room. She existed, she survived, and the truth finally had found her after 50 years lost. The case closed, but the lessons it left for California's investigative community would live long after the bold letters "Case Closed" on the final page. The story of Jenna Morris, the 12-year-old girl who vanished from Sacramento and reappeared nearly half a century later under a different identity, is not just an investigative miracle, but a mirror reflecting what America today still faces: the vulnerability of children, the limits of old legal systems, and the power of science when used correctly. The fact that Jenna survived 50 years unknown, swept into the fabricated life of Martha Reyes, reveals a terrifying reality. Without a persistent family providing DNA, without the hair strand kept in the backpack from 1975, or the forgotten Polaroid in evidence storage, her fate could have forever fallen into history's void. This is a direct reminder to American families today about storing photos, medical records, and identification traces of children, because sometimes just a small detail like Jenna's ankle scar or the 1972 X-ray film can save an entire life. Additionally, Harold Cain's constant movement across states in the 1970s highlights the need for federal coordination in missing persons searches. America is a vast country, and the most dangerous predators often exploit the disconnection between states. Jenna's story reminds us that we cannot rely solely on local agencies. The system needs linkage, faster, and more accurate data sharing. And finally, the case's revival through forensic genealogy sends a powerful message to American society. Science does not just catch the wicked, but restores identity, restores voice, and restores existence to those robbed of their lives. In an era where genetic data has become a vital tool, each of us needs to understand that cooperating with authorities, from submitting DNA to sharing missing persons information, not only helps one case, but can save generations to come. If you find the journey to reclaim the truth for Jenna Morris after 50 years meaningful and valuable, please hit subscribe to continue joining us in these humane case-solving stories full of scientific power. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where every small clue can change an entire life.